There's a man in the Northeast with $87 million to his name. He owns multiple homes, he's been wealthy for decades, and yet his total monthly spending is about $19,000. He flies commercial, his kids went to public school. When his advisor once suggested he could afford more, his response was simple. More what? I already have everything I want. Now, here's the part that should bother you. There's another couple, this time with about $400,000 saved between their retirement accounts, who are convinced they need $15 million before they can ever stop working. They're exhausted, they're anxious, and they're chasing a number they pulled from a comment thread, not a calculator. One person has more money than they could spend in several lifetimes and feels completely finished. The other has enough to be on a solid path and feels permanently behind. That contradiction isn't rare, it's the rule. I've spent years in rooms with accountants, advisors, and attorneys who manage actual wealth, not theoretical wealth. And once you see how wealthy people really live, something becomes impossible to ignore. The psychological distance between a few million and tens of millions is enormous. But the lifestyle distance? It's almost nothing. You're not flying private at either number. You're not buying yachts. You're mostly just deciding between the good option and the slightly better one. So the real question isn't how much money do you need, it's why do people with far less believe they need so much more? And once you understand the answer to that, you'll realize why most of you will never need anything close to $5 million, and why chasing a bigger number often has nothing to do with living a better life. I want to be clear about where this perspective comes from. This isn't theory. It's not a model I built in a spreadsheet and fell in love with. It comes from years of sitting across the table from people who actually have money, high earners, business owners, founders, and the advisors who manage their wealth for a living. I've been in rooms with accountants and fiscal lawyers who handle 8- and 9-figure balance sheets. And what you notice very quickly is that the way wealthy people talk about money looks nothing like the way the internet talks about money. They're not obsessed with hitting bigger and bigger numbers. They're obsessed with cash flow, stability, and not screwing up a good thing. And that's where the disconnect starts. Because once you get past a certain point, the relationship between money and lifestyle changes completely. The psychological difference between having $5 million and $50 million is enormous. One feels done, the other feels untouchable. But the lifestyle difference? It's almost invisible. You're not living 10 times better at 50 million than you are at 5. You're not suddenly doing things you couldn't do before. You're mostly just removing a few remaining frictions from a life that was already very comfortable. That's the part most people miss. So instead of thinking about wealth as one giant finish line, it's more useful to think of it like a ladder. The first few rungs change everything. They take you from stress to stability, from instability to choice. But at a certain height, the ladder keeps going, even though the view barely changes. And the mistake most people make is assuming that if the ladder exists, they must keep climbing it, without ever stopping to ask whether the next rung actually improves their life. That's the framework we're going to use going forward. If you actually map this out, the pattern becomes obvious. The bottom of the wealth ladder matters a lot. Every rung down there changes your life in a meaningful way. Going from $20,000 in savings to $100,000 is transformative. That's the jump from survival to stability. You can handle an emergency. You can survive a job loss. You stop living in constant reaction mode. You sleep better. Going from $100,000 to $500,000 still matters a lot. That's when options start to appear. Home ownership becomes realistic. Career risk becomes survivable. You can think about starting a business or stepping back from work without panic. You're not rich, but you're secure. Those rungs are real. They change how your life feels. But then something strange happens. Once you're north of a few $1 million, the ladder keeps going, but the experience stops changing. Going from 5 million to 10 million barely touches your day-to-day life. Going from 10 million to 50 million doesn't either. You're still eating at the same restaurants. You're still flying the same flights. You're still living in the same neighborhoods. The upgrades exist, but they're marginal. Slightly better seats, slightly nicer finishes, slightly more convenience. Not a fundamentally different life. You're not waking up happier. You're not suddenly free in a way you weren't before. You're mostly just paying more for versions of things you were already doing. And this is the part people struggle with. The ladder doesn't end after 5 million. You can keep climbing it forever. The rungs just stop meaning anything. Once you understand that, the goal shifts. It's no longer about getting as high as possible. It's about figuring out where the climb stops being worth it and having the discipline to stop there. At this point, this stops being a philosophical argument and turns into a data problem. Because once you look at how wealthy people actually spend, a lot of popular beliefs fall apart very quickly. There have been multiple surveys of high net worth households, business owners, founders, and long-time high earners, looking not at income, but at actual monthly spending. Not what people say they could spend, what they really do. And the pattern is remarkably consistent. Households with a net worth under $1 million tend to spend somewhere around $9,000 to $10,000 a month. That's about $110,000 to $120,000 a year. Comfortable but restrained. When you move up to households in the 1 to 5 million and 5 to 10 million range, spending rises, but only to about $15,000 a month, or roughly $180,000 a year. Nicer homes, better cars, better vacations. Still very recognizable lives. Here's where people expect the line to keep going up. It doesn't. When you look at households worth $10 to $20 million, or even $20 to $50 million, people who are earning $500,000 to $1 million a year, their median spending tends to land around $25,000 a month, about $300,000 a year. Read that carefully. People worth tens of millions of dollars are not spending millions a year. They're not living like movie villains. They're living very normal lives, just very nice versions of normal. No yachts, no private jets, no constant luxury. Just high-quality homes, reliable comfort, and the absence of financial stress. That's what the spending curve actually looks like. It rises early, and then it flattens hard. Which brings us to the obvious question. If this is what wealthy people actually spend, what does that mean for retirement? So let's take the most aggressive version of this conversation. Not the average retiree, not the conservative case. Let's look at the absolute upper bound of what a genuinely luxurious retirement would require. Assume you're a couple at full retirement age. You've both had long, successful careers, and you've maximized Social Security. One of you is receiving about $4,000 a month, the other about $2,000. That's $72,000 a year before you touch your portfolio. Now, let's be generous with spending. Say you want to spend $300,000 a year after taxes. That puts you in the top few percent of retirees in terms of lifestyle. Nice home, nice travel, no compromises. At that level of income, a 35% effective tax rate is reasonable. So to net $300,000, you need roughly $460,000 in gross income. Social Security is already covering $72,000 of that. That means your portfolio needs to generate about $388,000 a year. If we use a 4.7% withdrawal rate, which is on the aggressive end of what most research considers sustainable, you'd need a portfolio of about $8.3 million to support that spending indefinitely. Let's pause there. This is not a conservative number. This is not a minimalist lifestyle. This is an outrageously comfortable retirement by any reasonable standard. And it still doesn't get you to $10 million. That's the ceiling. That's the highest number you would ever realistically need to sustain a top-tier retirement lifestyle. Not the average, not the goal for most people, the maximum. And once you see that clearly, it becomes much harder to justify chasing numbers far beyond it. Now let's step away from the extreme case and talk about where most people who've done well actually land. These are high earners, professionals, executives, business owners, people pulling in somewhere between $300,000 and $350,000 a year during their peak working years. Wealthy by any reasonable definition, but not living extravagantly. Their spending is remarkably consistent, about $15,000 a month, roughly $180,000 a year. Nice homes, nice cars, good travel, a very comfortable life. Let's run that scenario. Same couple, same Social Security setup, about $72,000 a year coming in from the government. They want to spend $180,000 a year after taxes. At that income level, a 30% effective tax rate is realistic. That means they need about $260,000 in gross income. Social Security covers $72,000 of it. The portfolio only needs to generate $188,000 a year. At the same 4.7% withdrawal rate, that requires a portfolio of right around $4 million. Let that settle for a moment. $4 million supports a lifestyle that most people would describe as wealthy, especially in retirement. And that's not assuming extreme frugality or unrealistic returns. It's just math. And before someone immediately says, "That won't work where I live," it's worth pointing out something important. The spending data we looked at earlier includes people in high cost of living areas, major cities, expensive metros. These aren't theoretical retirees living in low-cost regions. They're living real lives in real places, and $4 to $5 million is covering it. At that level, you're not just fine. You're in the top tier of retirees in terms of comfort and spending. Not because the number is impressive, but because the lifestyle it supports already checks every meaningful box. This is usually where people push back. They'll say, "Sure, that works if I wait until Social Security, but I don't want to retire at 67. I want to be done earlier, 55, maybe even sooner." Most people assume that makes the number explode. It doesn't if you structure it correctly. The mistake is thinking your entire portfolio has to last forever. It doesn't. When you retire early, you're really solving two separate problems, not one. The first problem is the gap between early retirement and Social Security. That's a finite window, usually about 10 years, and because it has a defined end date, you can use a much higher withdrawal rate. This is what I call the bridge portfolio. Its only job is to fund your lifestyle until Social Security begins. It's not designed to last forever. Research shows that for time horizons like 10 years, withdrawal rates in the 8 to 10% range can be perfectly reasonable. Split the difference and call it 9%. If you need $260,000 a year in gross income to support a $180,000 lifestyle, that means your bridge portfolio needs to be about $2.9 million. That money gets drawn down intentionally. That's the plan. The second problem is funding the rest of your life after Social Security starts. Once Social Security kicks in, you're getting about $72,000 a year from the government. Now your portfolio only needs to generate $188,000. And here's the key detail most people miss. You don't need that second portfolio to be fully funded on day one of early retirement. You need it 10 years later. If that money stays invested while you're living off the bridge fund and grows at a modest 5 to 7% annually, you might only need $1.6 to $1.9 million in that long-term portfolio when you retire early. Over the decade, it compounds into the $3.1 million you need. Add it together. About $2.9 million for the bridge, about $1.6 to $1.9 million for the long term. You're right back in the $4.5 to $4.8 million range. Call it $5 million to be conservative. That's enough to retire 10 years early and maintain a lifestyle that puts you in the top few percent of retirees. Early retirement doesn't require extreme wealth. It requires proper structuring. At this point, a reasonable question is, if the math looks like this, why does everyone keep hearing much bigger numbers? The answer isn't complicated, but it is uncomfortable.
There's a lot of money made by convincing people that their number needs to be higher. If you're a financial advisor charging 1% of assets under management, would you rather manage $4 million or $14 million? If you're a platform selling financial products, does it help you more if people feel done or if they feel behind? If you're a content creator building an audience, do big, scary numbers keep people watching or do calm, sufficient ones? The entire system quietly rewards higher targets, and fear is the most reliable fuel. Bigger numbers feel safer. They create the illusion of control. If the target is far enough away, you never have to make a real decision. You can just keep working, keep saving, keep telling yourself you're being responsible. I once heard a fiscal lawyer in Chicago put it bluntly. He said, "The industry runs on anxiety. If people realized how little they actually need, half of us would be out of work." He was half joking. He was also completely right. Because once you stop and do the math, the fear loses its grip. And when fear disappears, so does the incentive to keep climbing forever. This is where the conversation stops being financial and starts being psychological. There's a well-documented phenomenon in behavioral economics called goalpost shifting. People set a target, they reach it, and almost immediately they move the target higher. Not because their life changed, but because their anxiety didn't. I've watched people with $3 million convince themselves they need $8 million. Then they get to $8 million and decide they need $15 million. The number keeps growing, even though their lifestyle stays the same. At that point, the number isn't a plan anymore. It's a proxy for fear. It's no longer connected to spending or needs or even desires. It's just a way to postpone the discomfort of saying, "This is enough." And that's the real trap. Because enough isn't something the math gives you automatically. You can have the numbers in front of you and still feel behind. You can hit every milestone and still feel exposed. Once the target becomes psychological instead of practical, it detaches from real life, from how you actually live, from what actually changes your day-to-day experience. That's why two people with wildly different net worths can feel the same level of insecurity, and why someone with objectively more than they could ever spend can still feel like they're not ready. The uncomfortable truth is this: there is no number that guarantees peace of mind. There is only a number that supports the life you actually live. And until those two things line up, the ladder never feels tall enough. Let me make this concrete with a real-world style example. Imagine a couple in their mid-40s, both working solid jobs, combined income around $200,000 a year, not extreme earners, but disciplined. They've been saving consistently for years and have about $1.2 million spread across their retirement accounts. They live comfortably, not extravagantly. Their current spending is around $120,000 a year. They want to retire at 55. In retirement, they expect to spend a bit more travel, more free time, call it $140,000 a year. Still reasonable, still grounded. They have 10 years to go. If their portfolio grows at a conservative 7% annually, and they continue contributing at the same pace they are now, they end up with about $3.4 million by the time they're 55. Now the structure matters. They need a bridge strategy to cover 10 years until Social Security. At a 9% withdrawal rate, funding $140,000 a year requires about $1.56 million. That leaves $1.84 million invested for the long term. Over the next 10 years, that money compounds to roughly $3.6 million by the time they reach full retirement age. At that point, Social Security kicks in, say about $50,000 a year. Now, your portfolio only needs to generate $108,000 annually. At a conservative withdrawal rate, that's more than covered. They're done. No heroic assumptions, no 8-figure target, no one more decade just to be safe. They didn't win by chasing a fantasy number. They won by aligning the math with the life they actually live.
Before wrapping this up, there are two important reality checks that need to be acknowledged.
The first is lifestyle inflation. Every single person I've spoken to who came into a large amount of money quickly, an inheritance, a liquidity event, a windfall, spent more than they expected to. Every single one. Not because they were reckless, because spending habits change faster than people anticipate. Bigger houses create bigger costs. Better travel becomes the baseline. Convenience creeps in quietly. The spending level you think you'll maintain in wealth is rarely the spending level you actually maintain. That doesn't break the math, but it does mean you need to be honest with yourself about what you'll really do, not what you hope you'll do. The second reality check is Social Security. In every scenario we've walked through, Social Security is doing a lot of work. If you're receiving $60,000 to $70,000 a year from it, that's income your portfolio doesn't need to generate. Remove Social Security from the equation, and the required portfolio jumps fast. In the earlier $4 million retirement scenario, taking Social Security out pushes the number closer to $5.5 million. That's a massive difference for a single line item. Even for wealthy retirees, Social Security matters a lot. These aren't reasons to panic, they're reasons to plan accurately. If you ignore lifestyle inflation, you'll undershoot. If you ignore Social Security, you'll overshoot. Getting this right means acknowledging both, without exaggerating either. So instead of chasing abstract numbers, here are 3 things that actually matter. First, track your real spending. Not what you think you spend, not what you tell yourself you spend, what actually leaves your accounts. Track it for 6 months. Most people are off by 30 to 40% when they estimate their own burn rate. You cannot plan for retirement if you don't know what your life actually costs. Second, use your real Social Security numbers. Go to the Social Security website, look at your statement, see what you're actually projected to receive, not what you assume, and not what someone on the internet tells you to ignore. For most people, it's more than they expect, and it dramatically lowers the size of the portfolio you actually need. Third, use a declining spending model. People don't spend the same at 80 as they do at 60. Travel slows down, eating out drops. Life gets smaller in some ways, even while remaining comfortable. Planning for peak spending forever is overly conservative. It keeps people working longer than necessary. None of this is complicated, but it requires honesty. Planning beats guessing. Precision beats fear. Once you replace vague anxiety with real numbers, the entire conversation changes. Most fortunes are built slowly, not through dramatic wins or perfect timing, but through consistency, patience, and doing a lot of boring things correctly for a long time. That part gets talked about endlessly. What doesn't get talked about is the harder skill, knowing when to stop. The wealth ladder doesn't disappear. It's always there. There's always another rung, another milestone, another reason to keep climbing. But at a certain height, the view stops changing. The people I know who retired early and stayed retired weren't the ones who optimized for the biggest possible number. They were the ones who figured out how tall the ladder actually needed to be and then had the discipline to stop climbing it. That's the part almost no one teaches. Because if you never stop climbing, you never have to decide that what you have is enough. Most people watching this will ignore everything you just heard and keep chasing a bigger number anyway. That's fine. There's nothing wrong with wanting more. But now, at least, you know. And once you know, you can't unsee it.